Welcome to Straight to the Point. I'm your host, Representative Joe Diorsi. In a world of long-windedness, I'm here to deliver you the Capitol News. So, let's get straight to the point. So, welcome to the Straight to the Point podcast. This is Representative Joe Diorsi, and I have a very special guest phoning in from one of the prettiest regions in the United States, the Blue Ridge area of Virginia. He is a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, a former Green Beret, and the host of a very popular podcast called Making the Argument. He is Nick Freitas. Nick, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Nick, I have to start out with this, with your military background. I wanted to, obviously we have new leadership in the White House and President Trump, and there was a lot of controversy with how President Biden handled the military. What's your initial take with just the changeover? I know that I recently heard that we are unveiling as a military the F-47, which is like the F-35 on steroids. I shared with you before we went online here about the messaging changes between like the former humanitarian type style messaging, like the Marine Corps is a global force for good, to a more mission true message now, like Marines fight to win. What's your take on the U.S. military now?
Well, my own son is actually in infantry basic training right now, so I'm actually pretty grateful that we're back to what I think is far more of a coherent mission focus, which is the United States military is supposed to be an overwhelming dominant force on the battlefield. And so that means everything from a morale component, a training component, a technological component, as well as combined arms integration. And so I think we actually have leadership in the White House and leadership within the Department of Defense now that recognizes that's the primary focus of the United States military and is responding appropriately, both with respect to policy and probably with respect to budgeting as well.
Yeah. So, Nick, tell me about your podcast. First of all, tell the listeners and the watchers where they can find it. But what's the goal of Making the Argument? Who's your audience, and who are you trying to appeal to?
Sure. So we made it easier. You can kind of find me anywhere on social media by just typing in Nick J. Freitas. But on our YouTube channel, that's where we post most of our content with respect to both the Y Minutes and Making the Argument, as well as Doge Watch. So the Making the Argument is kind of like our flagship podcast, and we talk about everything there from political philosophy, culture, theology, and a lot of what it's based around doing is kind of a combination of looking at sometimes current events, sometimes it's news cycle adjacent, but we're usually trying to get into some of the deeper cultural and philosophical implications of the various policy and things that are happening, whether it be in the political realm, or whether it just be going on with what's going on within in culture, specifically culture in the West right now. And so we kind of have a broad-based audience between men and women, younger people that are interested in some of the content that we talk about, especially with everything from, relationships, masculinity, femininity. And then we have a lot of people too that also want to tune in to kind of find out more about what's going on within political policy and understanding it not just from kind of the what you might call some of the simple right-left dynamics, but trying to go a little bit deeper into understanding, what is the proper role of government. And as we look at various issues that the government's trying to tackle, what is the appropriate role for the individual, for the community, as well as the government on your local, state, and federal level?
Yeah, so speaking culturally, something I noticed this election season is the only demographic that actually moved further right was the baby boomers. And the interesting fact about the baby boomers is they're the only demographic, I would argue, that consumes traditional media. Can you talk about
move further right or move further left?
Sorry, moved further left. Every other demographic inched or even took big steps to the conservative movement. Can you speak to that, especially since you're kind of like an alternative media guru? We have these channels like X, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. It seems like people are going there for their news, and certainly traditional media, network media, legacy media, even your CNNs and your MSNBCs and your Fox Newses are kind of falling by the wayside. Can you speak to that dynamic that we saw play out this election season?
Sure. I think a lot of your legacy media, I mean, you had almost complete ideological capture of CNN, MSNBC, et cetera. I mean, you could argue that Fox News is definitely more on the conservative side, but even then it appealed to a particular, I think probably, area of conservatism. That doesn't mean everybody was captured in that. The other thing too is when you have a legitimate 24-hour news cycle and you're waiting for certain shows to come on or whatever else it is, there's a massive delay between when something happens and when it gets reported. So I think more and more people now go to X. They also know that they're not going to be censored on X, and that's
Mhm.
been a huge source of concern for I think a lot of people viewing the news, especially a lot of younger people viewing the news ever since COVID. I think COVID broke a lot with respect to the media because it became very obvious that mainstream media was a lot more susceptible to parroting a party line than X and alternative forms of media were. And so I think a lot of people realize that it doesn't mean you're always going to get the truth. It doesn't mean you're always going to get the most polished opinion and analysis. But a lot of times you get it faster, and a lot of times you end up getting something that is a lot closer to the truth than the so-called fact checking mainstream media is. And I think some of your older generations, which is the baby boomer right now, they're a lot more comfortable with legacy media. Younger generations are looking for something else and looking for something that it's not that they just want to enter into an echo chamber, although that's certainly true of some people. It's that again, they kind of feel like the traditional corporate media just gives them a particular line, and if they want to get anything outside of that, they have to go to alternative forms and platforms.
Yeah, so you mentioned, Musk's purchase of formerly Twitter, now X. I believe I said it then, and I'll say it again now. I think it's one of the most important moves of probably my generation when it comes to media. Um, but there's this notion, particularly on the left, and I've dealt with this in the Pennsylvania legislature, Nick. I've introduced legislation to ensure free speech in higher ed because I don't know if Virginia institutions have this, but there's these mechanisms called bias reporting systems, bias response teams that basically it quells free speech in our universities. But why to some, many perhaps on the left, is speech dangerous? And where has that notion come from?
Well, I think what we need to understand is that a lot of some of the trends that let's distinguish between leftists and liberals. So the distinction I make between those two is I can have a conversation with a liberal because we may disagree on what the data tells us. We may disagree on a particular end state or whatnot, but we still believe that data plays an important role, that the laws of logic apply. A liberal is not someone that looks at me when they start to lose an argument and automatically come to the conclusion that I'm just a racist, a sexist, or a misogynist, right? They actually engage in intellectual debate and civil discourse. A leftist, on the other hand, is somebody that has pretty much adopted this kind of critical theory view of the world, right? Like everything is oppressor and oppressed, and
Hmm.
they're happy to use logic if they find it helpful to their argument. And the moment it's no longer helpful to the argument, you're just using a tool of the patriarchy. And people will hear me say that and be like, "Oh, that's surely, Nick, that's hyperbolic language." Really? Because I'm not the one that put up in the Smithsonian a big poster with that said attributes of whiteness and put on there the scientific method, objective and linear thinking, right? So no, they've absolutely adopted this kind of dialogue and this process of thought, if you can even call it that. And a lot of it, I thought initially, was designed to just shut down debate. Right? It's the moment you say something I don't like, that's violence. Well, now what we're starting to see on a lot of our university campuses is that it actually goes beyond that. They're not, you disagree with them on transgender ideology, and they don't just say, well, oh, you're perpetrating violence against trans people, so you should be quiet. They then perpetrate violence against you because after all, now they're just defending themselves.
Yep.
And so unfortunately, nobody asked the universities to push this. They did it themselves, and now they find themselves increasingly in an environment where they can't even control their own student body. And again, the excuse anytime you call them on it is, well, we're just trying to foster an environment of openness and making sure that marginalized populations can speak their mind and feel safe. It's like, look, what you should have is an environment where people can come and engage in civil discourse. Civil discourse requires some commitment to the ideas of the laws of logic and being polite and allowing people to say things even if you disagree with it. And the
Yeah,
university system has
civility.
increased. Yeah, and the university system, not all, right? But they've increasingly adopted a policy where they allow one side of the intellectual debate, one side of the ideological debate, to get away with everything and anything. And then when, the more conservative or the more libertarian side shows up to the debate, it's like, oh, well, that's going to cause these people to lose their minds. And so we've got to be careful about what you say because we don't want to upset them. Well, now, okay, now you've stifled freedom of speech, and you've taken the worst characters, the worst element in the debate, and you've essentially given them all of the advantages because the louder and the more violent and the more they engage in trespassing and vandalism, the more you appease them. And so you've created this realm of just spoiled brats that you've got to constantly cater to because you're worried about your campus being vandalized or occupied.
Yeah, well said. In the conversations I've had with, let's call them these types that you're describing here, there just seems to be generally an emotion attached to their argument, and really, to me, I mean, disagreement is a pretty normal thing, and like you said, it can be discussed civically rather. So. Uh, Let's talk Doge. You mentioned Doge Watch. Is that like a tributary of your show? Do you have the Doge tracker up? Are you discussing some of the waste that Musk and his team catches daily? Tell me about that.
So every Wednesday, we will drop a new Doge Watch episode where we basically give everyone like a 10 to 15-minute review of the highlights of what Doge has actually been doing. But then we also try to dive into what are the larger implications of what the various cuts mean, what the various struggles in the court system, what is all that what does all that entail? And a big reason why we wanted to do it is because I obviously feel that the federal bureaucracy has grown way out of control. When you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and then you look at what the federal bureaucracy has turned into, you're going to have a hard time syncing those two things up. And we knew as soon as Doge started to try to do its job, there were going to be people that were saying, "Oh my gosh, these poor federal workers," or "Oh my gosh, what's going to happen to all of these funds?" And what we wanted to help do was actually analyze, okay, what has Doge actually done? What does it actually cut? Is this something that the federal government should actually be doing? Because there's a lot of people that have this attitude that if the federal government is not doing something, therefore it's going to suddenly disappear and it can't be done. It's the old Bastiat quote, right? That the socialists conclude that because we don't want the federal government doing something, we don't want it done at all. No, it's that we recognize that a lot of the things that the federal government does includes by the very nature of how it operates a lot of fraud, a lot of waste, a lot of abuse. And the worst thing that I think Doge has actually uncovered is not the fraud, waste, and abuse. The worst thing at this point is that a lot of people are realizing as they're looking around, wondering what's going on in their schools, what's going on in their culture. They're now recognizing that their tax dollars were being weaponized by the federal bureaucracy, by a lot of these NGOs and nonprofits to push a political ideology in what should have been a fairly ideological, neutral, branch of the government.
Yep.
But that's obviously not what was happening, and I'm very glad that Doge has uncovered it. Now, the next question we have to ask ourselves is whether or not Congress is going to act on any of this, because the executive branch can only do so much.
Yeah, you look at like an NPR, and the stat is escaping me, but I want to say that every member of maybe their editorial board was a registered Democrat, and it's like
Mhm.
this isn't even MSNBC or Slate. This is national public radio. This is supposed to be inherently neutral and impartial, and you have an entire editorial board comprised of Democrats.
Well, and I think that the dangerous part of this is that for a while, people have been willing to accept a little bit of a left wing bias in certain institutions that maybe we thought should be more, neutral or objective in their analysis. What people will not accept, and I think have become much more aware of, is that again, their tax dollars being used to finance organizations, very partisan activities um, against them. And it's one thing when something's not for you. It's something entirely different when your money gets used to subsidize organizations that are now coming after you.
Yeah.
And that's been one of the biggest exposures that Doge has provided.
Yeah. So I heard through the grapevine that you recently paid the White House a visit.
Mhm.
Um, tell our watchers, our listeners, what took you there and what your experience was like.
Well, one of the things that the White House has recognized is that new media plays a much more predominant role with respect to how people get their news than in the past. And this has been the first White House I'm aware of that has actually wanted to open themselves up to communicate with new media. Now, obviously, they have their own objectives for that, right? They want to be able to talk to friendly outlets and get their message out. And in so much as I agree with something, I'm always willing to do that. But then again, I'm always very obvious with my audience about what my bias is. And so there have been times where I've agreed with the White House. There's been a couple times where I haven't necessarily, but what I've noticed is that their willingness to actually be open and transparent about what they're doing and put that information out is unlike any administration I've seen since I've been alive. Uh, and so a lot of it has been going up there to be able to ask questions. We're going to be going up there again later this month, hopefully to be doing some interviews with people on Doge, and again we'll ask hard questions. I've been interviewing Rand Paul and Pete Sessions and Mark Wayne Mullen. And we always try to be courteous, but we also try to get to the point of, okay, you said you're going to do this. When are you going to do it? And how can we tell that you're actually on schedule and plan to do it? And so that's been a great experience both with the White House and with the members of Congress, and hopefully pretty soon here with members of Doge that we're looking forward to speaking with.
So that's refreshing because those things that you just listed are aspects of what a journalist does, and we we haven't seen, as Ben Shapiro calls it, journalisming in America
Yeah.
here for quite some time. So here's my burning question, really, of our entire time together, Nick. We discussed a little bit before going on air, just the breakdowns of ages and sex on the different social media mediums. YouTube, you've got X, Instagram, and Facebook as well. And I would argue that you probably appeal to the younger tier of Americans. But why has, and we've already covered that the only group that went more left this past election cycle was the boomers. So that means everybody else, even young women, gravitated more towards the conservative side. What is it about the liberty message that has increasingly resonated with all of those other groups, particularly young people?
Well, I think for some people it is a liberty message. It's this idea that the government has just been an absolute mess for far too long, and really the government has put itself in a position of picking winners and losers, and I think a lot of people feel like they were the losers in that category. A lot of it too. I don't know that it's necessary liberty. I think it's people that are willing to certainly give what we might call the liberty movement hearing, but it's more of just like absolute frustration with the status quo.
Mm.
And that frustration with the status quo is, I think, what has kind of ushered in Donald Trump. I think it's what's ushered in a lot more people listening to people on social media that they think make sense, or at the very least are actually addressing issues that they see as issues in their own life in a way that, again, mainstream press, mainstream academia, mainstream Hollywood hasn't done. All of those organizations have increasingly catered to a very, very narrow focus. If you listen to a lot of guys talking on pop culture, they refer to it as the message. And I think people are just getting tired of that. And I think especially with young people, young men in particular, it's something like young men under the age of like 25 are now polling more conservative than since we started polling them at that age demographic. And I
That's
think a lot of
amazing.
that has to do with young men in particular feeling like they've just been alienated by wokeism, by the feminist movement. They've been, somehow they've been simultaneously accused of being fat, lazy, stupid, dumb, and incels, but also being responsible for all of the ills which confront humanity. And they've especially said, yeah, screw that. We're done with being blamed for everything at a time where we feel like we're at the probably the biggest disadvantage we have been in recent history. And so a lot of people are looking for alternative understandings of what has been going on in the world. And again, hopefully, I want to be someone that can actually provide a viewpoint, a perspective. I recognize that mine isn't the only one, but I certainly think we've done a better job of actually explaining what's been going on socially, culturally, economically, and politically a lot better than Rachel Maddow does.
Yeah.
And I think that gets reflected essentially in the ratings.
Yeah, so as we part ways here, Nick, if you can remind my watchers and listeners what mediums they can find you at and under what name.
We're pretty much on every prominent social media platform you can think about. You can look at Nick J. Freitas. If you type that in, that'll pretty much bring it up. If you also want to specifically look for some of our programming, Making the Argument, Doge Watch, and the Y Minutes are three of our most prominent programs.
Okay, so he's a former Green Beret, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and again, host of the podcast Making the Argument. Find him on any and all available mediums. Nick, thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
This has been Straight to the Point. Visit repjod.com/mypodcasts.